This is how I use one reverb to create depth and width in a mix, to set a stage for all the instruments to play in, to glue everything together, to make things stand out. It just works. So I have quite a convoluted reverb setup, no pun intended, but it is a little bit complicated, but it does allow me to create a lot of depth in my mix. It really does allow me to push things right to the back of a mix or bring things right to the front of a mix. I'm going to go through it slowly. I'm going to try and go through it quite precisely. Hopefully it'll be made clear just how cool this sort of matrix is. You can see here I have a track called ER, that stands for early reflections, and you can see here I have a track called Reverb. So the Reverb has a reverb plugin on it that has only the late reflections, and the early reflections channel has a reverb plugin on it that only has the early reflections. I'm just choosing to independently control how much early reflections a sound gets versus how much late reflections a sound gets, individually per track in the mix. Where it gets slightly more complicated is the input to the reverb actually has 3 different sends, 3 different returns on it. So I have a 0 milliseconds pre-delay, a 30 milliseconds pre-delay, and then an 8th note pre-delay. All of these are just delays on 100% mix that get pushed into one reverb. So if I solo the reverb whilst listening to everything in the mix, I just solo the reverb, everything's going to sound out of time because some things will be hitting it with no pre-delay and some things will be hitting it with an 8th note pre-delay. The reason why I have these different setups is that if I want a snare to be at the back of the mix, I can send it to the reverb with no pre-delay. That means the transient and the reverb reach the listener's ear at the same time, which helps push it backwards in the mix. But now, if I've got a lead vocal that I want to reach the listener before the reverb sound, then I can send it via the 8th note pre-delay into the reverb. That way you get the vocal, blah, 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 and then almost like a delay, you get this whole echo. So if we both go into a concert hall right now and we stand near each other and I start singing, apart from the fact that that's going to sound dreadful, what you'll notice is you can hear me singing to you really closely, but you can also hear a load of reverb happening later. And that's a really, really cool way of replicating that effect. So we've got 0 milliseconds, that makes sense. And then we got an 8th note, and that makes sense. But the 30 milliseconds, what's that for? That is for everything in the middle. So normally it's like guitars, things like that. Anything that I want to be in front of the drums, but behind the vocals. Or for example, I might choose to put the snare into the 30 milliseconds pre-delay, but the overheads into the 0 milliseconds pre-delay. That way, all the cymbals can sit slightly behind the snare. It's really convoluted, but it's not actually that complicated. I'll show you the routing now. So we've got early reflections, this reverb, on its own send with pre-fader so I can control the wet and dry mix. And then I'll set up 3 more sends on every single channel in the mix so that I can have pre-0, pre-30 and pre-8th note. Then all of these get summed into one reverb. This is a really good way of training yourself and training your ear to recognize depth in a mix. You really want to be able to create some sort of foreground and some sort of background, light and shade, contrast in your mix so that it's super, super interesting, right? You don't want everything up front, super dry all the time. You got to use your faders, your EQs and reverbs to create this depth. That way you'll create a really, really interesting texture and world for the music to live in. So you can see on both of these reverb channels, I have an EQ before and after the reverb. What I like to do is a little bit of filtering before the reverb. I like to filter off maybe some of the highs and some of the lows. I think this is called like the Abbey Road reverb trick. Essentially, you don't need the low end of your bass or your kick or your snare or anything like that, creating a load of like muddy, weird stuff in your mix. Similarly, you might not want to have a load of sort of fake sounds off of your vocals, triggering really bright reflections in the reverb. Rather than just cut them out after the reverb, I like to cut them out before the reverb, and that results in a more sort of natural reverb sound. That said, because I put everything into one reverb plugin, that can get quite built up and quite muddy. You can also get spiky stuff happening in the mid-range from all the vocals. So I like to be able to control that too. So for example, a typical EQ move for me, if we have pre on the left and post on the right, might be something like this. So I'm only sending everything above sort of 200 to 400 hertz, and then everything below sort of 5 to 2.5K, something like that. And then afterwards, that might be quite muddy. So I might decide to take out some low mids. Maybe the mid range in it is bringing it to the front of the mix too much, and I can just soften it up ever so slightly. And then that way it's focused in a way that doesn't tread on the dry vocals. It doesn't build up too much. If I have a really, really dense arrangement, or I want the reverb to be a really, really clear sound in the mix, I might even do some boosting EQ to make it poke out at a certain frequency. Or what I might do is compress it very gently. Compressing before the reverb will definitely glue things together a bit, but it can also get a bit mushy, especially if you've got things going in at different sounds and you're using lots of different sends. It can sort of undo some of your work there. Whereas compressing afterwards will solidify the reverb. Again, if you go over like too much, if you compress it by loads, again, it's just going to get a bit weird and a bit muddy. But just a few dB can make a massive difference and help it poke out in the mix just where you want it. So then both of these reverbs just get sent to the stereo mix. So don't forget, you can download this template from the link below. And if you've got any questions, just leave them in the comments. Like and subscribe for a new video every week. Shred and art.